Mirrorless cameras offer great image quality and design, and you don't have to break the bank to get one. In this video, I've got budget options for beginners and casual users along with professionals looking to get started. And you'll see links in the description down below for the best pricing and the most current pricing for all the products that we talk about today. And the first camera on our list today is the Canon M50. The Canon M50 is an ideal camera for beginners or people using their first mirrorless camera. The Canon M50 has pretty much everything you could want in a camera, along with really user-friendly design and strong image quality. One thing to note though is that the Canon M50 actually comes in two versions, the Canon M50 Mark I and the Mark II, but the two cameras are very similar. But later in this video, I will explain what the difference is and which one is right for you. For starters, both cameras have a 24 megapixel sensor that delivers sharp and detailed photos and video. And because it's a Canon camera, it has great colors right in camera. Your photos and videos almost need zero editing. And speaking of photos, this camera shoots 10 frames per second, which is quite fast and really fast enough to shoot any kind of subject matter. Concerts, weddings, travel, cars, sports, really whatever you feel like shooting. Along with that, it has 14-bit RAW, which gives you a ton of flexibility when it comes to your color and exposure. And autofocus is where this camera really shines. It has Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is fast and reliable in both photos and video mode, regardless of whether you're using the optical viewfinder or the rear LCD. And this is where you see a difference between the M50 Mark I and the M50 Mark II. The M50 Mark I has intelligent face and object tracking, where the Mark II has intelligent face, object, and eye tracking, which gives you more accurate autofocus, but it's also about 30% faster than the Mark I. The difference between the two cameras is only about $50, so it's not really the end of the world. But the Canon M50 Mark II does have wireless live streaming capabilities for someone who's a Twitch streamer or a YouTube streamer. And both cameras are really good choices for someone that's mainly video focused. Both cameras do full HD at 24 and 30 frames per second, which is real time, and they do slow motion at 60 frames per second in full HD. They also give you 120 frames per second, which is 5 times slow motion, but in that mode, it drops the resolution down to 720p, which is a bit low by today's standards. Now the M50 does have 4K, but when you're in 4K mode, it's pretty much pushing this camera to its very limit. And in 4K mode, you get two major problems. For one, you get a huge sensor crop, which crops into your image and kind of destroys your image quality, but also the spectacular autofocus simply goes away and it becomes a little slow and a little unreliable. I wouldn't really use the M50 as a 4K camera. I think 4K is a nice feature to have for detail shots and product shots, but for the most part, this is really an HD camera. But if you are someone that does need 4K, don't worry. The rest of the cameras on this list offer fantastic HD and 4K. So what exactly makes the M50 such a good camera besides the image quality, price, and why is it so good for beginners? The Canon M50 has absolutely spectacular design that's easy enough for anybody to pick up and get great results with this camera. The Canon M50 has a side articulating screen which makes it easy to film yourself but also get high angle and low angle shots. On top of that, the side articulating screen also has touch autofocus and touch controls. You can operate the entire camera just from the touchscreen. And it's got excellent Canon ergonomics. The button layout is minimal, the menus are minimal, it's an easy camera to figure out, it's an easy camera to just pick up and get great results with. Plus, it has an input for external audio mics. Overall, the Canon M50 is a fantastic camera with great design and fantastic image quality. The only thing that really holds this camera back is the cropped 4K. So if you're someone that doesn't want to compromise and you want a camera that's going to last you for years to come, this next camera is definitely something you want to look at. And next up, we have the Nikon Z50, which completely fixes the crop issue in 4K mode, and it still has great design. The Nikon Z50 is currently my favorite casual everyday camera because this camera is such a pleasure to use. I originally fell in love with this camera when I shot some photos with it at sunset, and I was pretty blown away by the colors and the design and feel of this camera. It has a 20 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is slightly lower resolution than the competition, but the lower resolution actually makes this camera better in low light because it allows for wider pixels that are able to capture more light. I'm kind of a nerd, I know. Although the in-camera noise reduction with the Z50 is a little bit overkill, and I actually recommend turning it off completely. The saturation in the Nikon Z50 isn't as strong as the M50, but I think that's okay because Nikon generally has more neutral and cooler colors. You can easily edit your colors later on if you want. And in terms of photos, it shoots at 11 frames per second in 14-bit RAW. 11 frames per second is again pretty much the same as the M50. You can shoot pretty much anything you want, and the 14-bit RAW is going to give you a ton of flexibility when it comes to editing your colors. And video is personally why I think most of you guys will be interested in this camera. It shoots at 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second with zero crop. The image itself is sharp and crisp despite being a lower resolution sensor, and it is still good in low light when it comes to video. Apart from that, it delivers full HD resolution at 24 and 30 frames per second, plus it has 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion while maintaining full HD resolution, and it does not drop its resolution down to 720p like the M50 does. The Z50 pretty much fixes all of the issues I had with the M50. Although I will say this, the autofocus is very important when it comes to photos and videos, and it's not quite as good as the Canon M50 or most Canon mirrorless cameras. I would say if Canon is a 9 out of 10, the Z50 is closer to 7.5 or 8 out of 10. But overall, it's still pretty solid autofocus. And the Z50 does have an input for external audio mics. The one downside of the Z50 is that the screen flips to the bottom if you want to see yourself, but when it's flipped to the bottom, you can't put it on a tripod, or you can't put anything at the bottom of your camera. Ideally, I would have liked to see a side articulating screen like the M50, but I think it's a small thing for an otherwise great camera. Overall, the Z50 is a great camera for casual users. Nikon specifically made the ergonomics better for casual users rather than professional shooters, which is probably to protect their more expensive professional camera line. But maybe you're more than a casual shooter. Maybe you're looking to do something a little bit more serious. Maybe you're a YouTuber, vlogger, content creator, or even a professional shooter that wants to shoot corporate videos. In that case, the next two cameras are probably closer to what you're looking for. Let's start off with the Canon M6 Mark II. The M6 Mark II is a compact camera, but what makes this camera really special and made it stand out for me is the fact that it has a whopping 32 megapixel sensor. Most cameras on the market are 20, 24. This has 32, which actually means that the sensor is on par with more expensive professional cameras like the Canon 90D, but it's also the highest resolution compact camera on the market today. And on top of that, it still has those gorgeous Canon colors that require almost zero editing. There's enough resolution in this camera for any type of pro work like wedding, corporate, fashion, product shots, whatever you want to do. And if you're a casual shooter, you're just going to get a really good camera. In terms of photos, this camera is fast. It shoots 14 frames per second in photo mode with 14-bit RAW. That's going to give you a ton of flexibility. But video is where I think this camera really shines because it does 4K video with no crop, and you get to have those amazing Canon colors that need no editing, and you get to have the phenomenal Canon autofocus. On top of that, it still does HD video at 24 and 30 frames per second, but it also does full HD up to 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. And like I said earlier, it still has Canon's dual pixel autofocusing system, which works amazingly well in both photos and videos. You get eye tracking, object tracking, and face tracking. Design-wise, the buttons are minimal, the menus are minimal, and it's a really easy camera to use. I don't love the flip screen that comes up to the top because I would rather have a side articulating screen for professional use, but it's a small caveat for this camera. And on top of that, it does have an input for external audio mics and an input for headphones so that you can monitor your audio. And I know this camera doesn't look like a professional camera, but I personally really like the fact that it's a compact camera, it's easy to travel with, it's easy to put on a gimbal, and it's easier to get handheld shots with. If you can get past the way this camera looks, it offers a ton of horsepower and great technology. The only thing the M6 Mark II is missing is the fact that it doesn't have cinema profiles for professional level color grading. But if you do want to professionally color grade your videos and you want log in your camera, this next camera is exactly what you're looking for. And the final camera we have is the Sony ZV-E10, and this camera is an absolute powerhouse. But here's the thing, the ZV-E10 is pretty much sold out everywhere. I don't think it's a huge issue, and I do expect this camera to be back on shelves very soon. But let's also talk about the Sony a6400, which is pretty much the same camera with a slight design difference that I'll explain later in this video. Both cameras have a 24 megapixel sensor that do 14-bit RAW in photos, but here's what makes these cameras special. They're amazing in low light. They can literally see in the dark. Most cameras have an ISO range of somewhere around 3200, 6400, and after that they start to look pretty bad. Sony cameras on the other hand can look good as high as 10,000, even 20,000 ISOs. These things are low light monsters. In terms of photos, these cameras shoot between 10 to 11 frames per second, but you get the additional benefit of your photos looking really good in low light. But on top of that, the autofocusing system in Sony cameras is without a doubt the best autofocusing system in the industry. Sony cameras have intelligent face and object tracking, but on top of that, the autofocusing system is just simply faster than the other brands out there. It honestly feels like everything's always in focus all the time. And this autofocusing system holds true for both photos and videos. And speaking of video, both the Sony ZV-E10 and the a6400 have phenomenal 4K video. It's actually super sampled from 6K video, which means you get the sharpness and detail of a 6K image, but in a 4K package. It shoots 4K at 24 with no crop, with a teeny tiny crop when it comes to 4K at 30, but I promise you it's such a small crop you will barely notice, if at all. And on top of that, it does full HD at 24:30, but also at 120 frames per second for buttery smooth slow motion. Both cameras have S-Log2, S-Log3, and cinema profiles, which make it a lot easier to color grade your video. But that's not to say that color grading your video is easy, because it does take a little bit of skill and time to learn how to properly color grade these profiles. So what exactly is the difference between the Sony ZV-E10 and the a6400? The main difference is really in the design of these cameras rather than the technology within. When it comes to frame rates and resolution, you're going to get the exact same thing. Both cameras have a small and compact body with a pretty minimal button layout, but the menus are pretty cumbersome and take a while to figure out. But the main difference that I think you guys will see is that the Sony ZV-E10 has a side articulating screen like the Canon M50, but the a6400 has a screen that comes up to the top. On top of that, the ZV-E10 has a really minimal button layout. The a6400 has more custom buttons and a custom mode dial on it, which might be better for someone that's a professional like a cinematographer or a wedding shooter. And the ZV-E10 is probably better suited for a YouTuber, vlogger, or a content creator that doesn't need all those fancy custom buttons. You simply want to turn your camera on, talk to it, and get something good on camera. But one thing that I do have to mention is that when it comes to Sony cameras, the battery life is not the greatest. These cameras are really small with a ton of horsepower, so they eat through battery pretty quickly. I definitely recommend picking up a spare battery. Amazon has some really cheap batteries that are off-brand and won't cost you nearly as much as the professional branded Sony batteries. Personally, I think if you already have a camera, you should wait for the Sony ZV-E10 and get the camera that's right for you. But if you don't have a camera, it's better to start now than to wait, and I would pick up the a6400 and just simply start making stuff right away. But when it comes to getting great photos and videos, it's not about which camera you use, it's about learning how to use your camera to its full potential. So if you want your videos to go from looking like this to this, and your photos to go from looking like this to this, then be sure to check out the free training in the description down below. I put together my 7 simple secrets that show you exactly how to get the most out of the gear that you're using right now, even if that gear is a smartphone. So take the easy step to learn how to really improve your work today. Make sure to check out the link in the description down below.